Hi folks, welcome to the Prepared Homestead. This is Travis. Thank you all for stopping by to watch. Today we want to talk about something that I believe is one of the most important things to put into your prepping plan and as a homesteader, and that is food preservation. I talk often about growing food, gardens, raising animals, foraging, things like that that are very important, especially for long-term survivability and long-term sustainability. But if you don't have the equipment that you need and the knowledge to preserve that food, it's not going to do a whole lot of good to do a lot of growing, because while you can eat it fresh when it's growing, come wintertime, what are you going to do? You need to be able to preserve that food so that you can eat it all winter long up until the next season when you can start harvesting fresh new stuff. And so today I want to point out at least some things that you can have in your arsenal to help you preserve those foods that you're going to be growing and raising. I'm sure many of you can hear the puppies off to the side, and I have put them up so that they're not all going crazy around me, because that's what they like to do, and they're not very happy. So I apologize if you can hear the crazy yelps of the puppies, but I assure you they are totally fine. So back to the stuff. Again, I know some of you are going to say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? Of course, there are many other things that you can get into equipment-wise, and there's a lot of utensils and stuff, but I'm trying to cover the basics in this video, especially for those of you that's just kind of starting out, and you realize that while having food preps, in your storage is really important, that's really in the end just a short-term solution. And for a real long-term solution, you need to be able to preserve your own food. And really, with the things that are changing today in this world, this kind of stuff is more important really than it's ever been. Having food preps, short-term food storage is important for, short-term events that may last weeks, months, or even a couple of years. But the things that we are looking at on our horizon in this world today can be very long-term or even permanent problems. Shortages of foods, high increased prices of foods, manipulation and control of food markets, and of course possibly, and maybe even most importantly, events like the grand solar minimum that could make it difficult to grow enough food and to purchase enough food for the planet's population. So that's why I have always encouraged, and even more so now, that we need to be growing, producing, raising our own food as much as possible, and you need to know how to preserve that food. So I'm just going to go in on the items that are here on the table. You don't have to choose these brands. These are examples. There are a few things that the brands, I will show you the specifics of them and the importance maybe of that particular brand. But most items are just kind of a general idea of something in that category. So we'll start on this end. This is a dehydrator. You can get them in all shapes and sizes and so on. This one is not an Excalibur. It's called a LEM, L-E-M. It's very much like an Excalibur. Excalibur dehydrators are kind of maybe the industry standard for home dehydrators, higher quality ones. They're very good. This one is very similar to that, but a little bit cheaper in price, and I was able to get a pretty good deal on it, so purchased it. Now, last year, during the height of the shutdowns, a lot of these items became very difficult to get a hold of. And we saw that just a small kind of hiccup in the supply chain can really make it difficult to get items. Now, some of these items have come back, and we're able to get them a little bit easier. But you need to be aware of that if things start to get bad again for whatever reason, some of these items may become very difficult to obtain again. So if you're able to, and you're in the market for some of these items, you might want to kind of think about getting them. An item like this is very good. You can preserve meat, basically your jerky. And with that, you can also make pemmican. But it's very good for vegetables, herbs, fruits, that kind of stuff. And an item like this is much better than what you would find at like a Walmart or something. You've seen probably the round ones that you stack, and they're kind of flimsy, and they kind of do a so-so job, but they don't last too long. An item like this is going to last much longer. Now, before I move on, I do want to mention that some of these items, as you will see, are non-electric, and they're specific because they're non-electric, and I want to point them out. So we're not talking about just items that you can purchase that need electricity, but there's items that are non-electric, and there's a reason why they are. The next item I want to move to is, I won't talk too much about it, but this is a cheese press. So if you have goats or a cow and you want to make cheese, this can come in great, very handy to make cheese. And they're very easy to make. You can find, you know, diagrams and blueprints and so on of them online, and they're very easy to make. But something like this will come in handy. The next item, this one's kind of my favorite. This was my great-grandmother's, and it's a coffee grinder. You can still get these, but the ones that are out on the market today are usually pretty flimsy. I would recommend, if you're wanting to find an old-timey coffee grinder, is try to find one at a thrift store or flea market or something like that. But coffee is kind of important to a lot of us, and I stock up on green coffee beans and roast them myself. And so I like to have a way to grind them. And even though this one is very old, it still works perfectly fine. And while typically I use an electric way to grind my coffee, I do have this backup that I can use, and I occasionally still use this. And like I said, it grinds fine. In fact, the grind quality, I feel, is better than any electric one I've ever used. It makes a really, really good grind. Moving on, this is a Vitamix food blender. And the reason why I'm pointing this one out and have this out on the table, it's not necessarily because it's a blender and that's something you should have, but a Vitamix is really different. For those of you that own them and know what a Vitamix is, you know what I'm talking about. It's not just your standard run-of-the-mill food blender. It is very heavy duty, and yes, they cost a lot more. But you can grind flour in this. You can mill your flour, take your wheat, and turn it into flour in something like this. Coffee, you can make shaved ice. This thing is very heavy duty. They last a very, very long time. And their capabilities are much, much better than just your standard blender. And this one we had purchased new years ago. But last year we had a little flea market and found another one. Perfectly fine, working, had the canister and everything, and they only wanted, I think, 20 or 25 bucks for it. So be on the lookout for stuff like that when you go to little flea markets and stuff, because these things can cost several $100s brand new. These two items next have a lot of similarity, but they're still different. This is obviously a pressure cooker canner right here. This is a Presto one. It's pretty standard and common, nothing special about it. But you do need, of course, a heat source, stove top. They do make a type that you don't have to, that you can use on wood fire. Most of these you cannot, including this one. It's just not heavy duty enough. Someday we would like to get one that you could use on a wood fire, but we do have a very large wood-fired water bath canner, and I've made videos of that on here if you want to look at that. It's a standalone system. It'll do 40, 50 quarts at a time. So we have that for now. And then this one is an electric one. This is kind of like an Instapot, but it's not an Instapot brand. It will do everything that an Instapot will do, but it will also pressure can. And an Instapot will not pressure can food, or at least it's not safe to pressure can. And this one, it is safe. And so having the size of family that we have, having an Instapot is very helpful. But as far as food preservation, this is helpful because there are times maybe you're making bone broth or some type of vegetable broth or just a small batch of food that you want to preserve. Sometimes getting out the big canner and going through the whole process is a little, it kind of gets in the way of things. But if you're just canning just a few jars, something like this is excellent. You plug it in, set it, and it's done. And so we really enjoy having something like this, especially for the small batches occasionally that you might do. Moving on. This here is also very important. It is a vacuum sealer, and they make several different brands of them. They're a pretty simple item to have, but boy, they can sure make your life pretty easy, especially from a preparedness and homesteading standpoint. You can vacuum seal all sorts of things. We also vacuum seal herbs. This one, you can also hook it up to jars like these, and you can vacuum seal a jar. So if you want to seal up dry goods or something that you don't want to put under heat pressure to seal, you can seal them this way. Make sure you have plenty of bags on hand. You can get them in rolls. They're not terribly expensive, and that way you have a good supply of the bags that you need to vacuum seal items. Another one here, we picked this up at an Amish store. And again, if you live near an Amish community, I would check them out, because a lot of times you can find really good items, and of course most of their items are non-electric because they don't have electricity. And this one here is a juicer, a fruit and vegetable juicer. So if you want to make like a tomato sauce or tomato soup, this works excellent for that. And of course it's a hand crank. It's pretty simple. This one here, I want to skip to this one, and this is probably one of the more important items on the table. This is a flour mill. Obviously, it's a hand crank flour mill. This brand, a lot of people might ask, and I can't remember the brand. This is a Nezco Nugget. Is that right? I never can remember the name. Hold on just a second, and I apologize. Yeah, a Nezco Nugget. Flour mills are very important. You should be stocking up on wheat. Wheat is really cheap to stock up on. You can buy it in, anywhere between 25 and 50-pound bags for not a lot of money. But, well, is it going to do you any good if you don't have a way to turn it into flour? And like I said, this Vitamix can do that. It's not the finest type of flour, but it's enough that it will work. But if you want a true fine flour, you're going to need a mill to grind it. And there are several mills out on the market. They have electric ones, obviously. This one we bought specifically because it's manual. And in times that the electricity doesn't work or it's just completely gone, we're able to grind it ourselves without the need of having electricity on hand. And the thing that you need to be aware of with a lot of these mills, and a lot of people kind of get caught buying junk. If you get on Amazon or eBay and you search for flour mill, you'll find a lot of items that look similar to this, and they may only be $20 to $40. These things come from China. They're very, very poor construction, but most importantly is they're not a flour mill. They're made to crack corn, and at the best you might get a corn meal out of them, but usually you won't even get something like that. They don't last very long. They're very flimsy, and I've known people that have, unaware of this and have purchased them thinking that they were getting a flour mill for $30 or $40, and in fact they got something that is not even capable of grinding flour into, or wheat into flour, and it doesn't last very long either. This is about the cheapest hand crank flour mill on the market that I would even consider, and this one is around $200 or so, maybe a little bit more now because of the price increase of things. There's also Wonder Mill. They make a hand crank one. I think there may be a couple of others, but you can't hardly find even the hand cranks for under $200. And if you go to a good electric flour mill, $2 to $6, maybe even up to $1,000. They're not cheap because it takes a lot more to turn wheat into flour than just cracking corn or grinding like a coffee bean. So make sure you get something that's going to last. We also have a meat slicer. This is kind of an old school meat slicer. If you're preserving meats, something like this can come in handy. Obviously, it's not necessary. You can use a knife if you want to. But finding stuff like this at a thrift store, which is where we purchased this at a thrift store for $10, and it works perfectly fine. It's good to have in your food preservation arsenal. Now, last but certainly not least, probably the most important item on the table are canning jars. You need canning jars. And during this past shutdown last year, canning jars, well, they dried up. And people were almost fighting trying to find them. They finally come back. I've been seeing them at certain stores. But we always try, kind of like when a lot of people, including us, add food preps to just their monthly budget. We also do canning jars in our monthly budget, and we try to pick up at least a couple of cases, if not more, every month and just stock them away because they're very important and you need them. But along with canning jars, lids and bands, you need to have those on hand so that over the years you can continue to can. There's certain utensils and tools that you need for canning, and so it's good to have those. But certainly whenever you're able, I encourage you to stock up on canning jars because as we saw this past year, it doesn't take much for them to just kind of dry up and go away. Another item I threw out here just as an example, this is obviously an old school style egg beater. Most people nowadays use the electric style, but it's good to pick up stuff like this. Again, we picked this up at an Amish store, and they have a lot of items like this that are non-electric. And I would encourage you to get things like this along the way, even though they may not be the highest priority on your prepping list. It's definitely beneficial to have things that don't require electricity because in a short-term or very long-term scenario, electricity is something that could kind of disappear. And having the ability to do the things you need to do without electricity are going to be important. That's all that I have on the table, but before I end, I want to also mention there's other things that you can do, of course, that I don't have here, and that's like building a smokehouse. I would encourage you to do some research on that. An American Homestead, which is another YouTube channel, has a really great video on a cold smokehouse that they built a few years ago. Look them up on YouTube, an American Homestead. They have excellent content, and they have a good video on that. Other items that you could do are root cellar, and there's a lot of different ways you can do a root cellar. Everything from having it professionally done to digging it and constructing it yourself out of more natural materials, all the way to just simply burying trash cans or old freezers in the ground to create a cold storage for things like root vegetables and winter squash and of things of that nature. This is all very important in your preparedness and homesteading journey. I cannot emphasize enough that not just growing food is important, but preserving your food is important. The early homesteaders and pioneers 100 to 150 years ago or more, yes, they grew food, they foraged food, they hunted, and they raised animals, but they would not have survived if they didn't know how to preserve their food. Because that fresh food, as you know, is only going to last so long. So learning the skills to preserve food, but also having the tools that you need to preserve that food is very critical, not just for preparedness, but also for that self-sustainability factor of just not being so dependent on the system, because you can not just grow, but also preserve your food for a long time. And, as far as like canning, that is, to me, that's kind of the gold standard of long-term food, because I personally have eaten food that was canned in a jar that's, well over 20 years old. If it's done properly and it's stored properly, a lot of times it will last a very, very long time. All right, folks, that's about all for this video. I hope it's been helpful to you. If you have suggestions, go ahead and leave them in the comments, because I know I certainly have not covered every type of item that you can have for food preservation. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.